Good evening and welcome to another live webinar from Harmony Equine and Harmony Muzzle. Thanks for attending. Certain parts of the country are already experiencing the polar vortex, and it's supposed to hit here late tonight, so this is good timing for our blanketing talk. So we're going to just look at blanketing from a common sense approach, hopefully, and just give you some food for thought. So as we think about the idea of blanketing or not, it actually isn't just a simple yes or no. First, you have to decide if you live in a cold place. And certainly there's a lot of horses wearing blankets in areas of the country they really don't need blankets. And we'll talk about clipping and that later on. Do you have shelter from wind and rain in their pasture area or barn, or shelter for them to go into? Does the horse live inside or out most of the time? One of the important things is, are you going to ride hard enough to produce a lot of sweat? Are you going to ride often, or are in reality you a fair weather rider and you're really only going to get on your horse a few times in the winter? And that then decides whether you're going to need to clip your horse or not. And we'll talk about clipping in a little more detail, because if you're going to ride a lot, you might have to clip, which means you might have to blanket. Do you have time to dry the coat out after you ride? If you're trying to squeeze in a quick ride and then want to throw a blanket back on, then you might actually need to do something to keep them warm while they're actually still wet. Is your horse, individual horse, cold or warm natured? Some horses are very warm naturally, some horses are very cold. And is your horse very old? So when we look at the temperature, horses are designed for cold weather. They do much better in cold weather than they do in hot weather. There's certainly certain breeds that will do well in hot weather, but for the most part, if you ask a horse, bring on the cold. Their fur is there to work, and it insulates. So in this picture, you see a horse with a blanket on and the snow piled on top, and you see two horses with no blankets on and the snow is piled on top, just about the same thickness. So what that means is that the horse is warm, but there's enough insulation in the fur that on the outer layer of fur, it is actually the same temperature as it is outside. So when we touch that fur, it feels cold to us. So then we want to put clothes on. But that feeling cold means that it's actually keeping all the horse's heat inside. They fluff up their coats to insulate. And they also exercise. So on a cold day, a lot of times you'll see them just take off and run around the pasture or walk around, depending on their natural level of activity. But none of my guys are particularly young, and they'll just take off and run around the pasture a couple of times and then go back to eating. So they have ways of keeping warm. Moisture. This is an important thing to look at. The hardest temperature for a horse to stay warm in is 32 to 40 degrees Fahrenheit, just above freezing when it's raining. As long as they're not wet to the skin, they can stay warm enough. Once their skin gets wet, they do get cold. And in nature, what they're going to do in a driving rain is to go and find some kind of shelter. And if you have shelters in your field, you may find the only time they use those shelters is when it is cold and rainy. They may not use it the whole rest of the year. So if you don't have trees, or you don't have a shed or a place for the horses to get under in that kind of weather, that's an important time to use blankets. They do shiver to keep warm, And just because they're shivering is not necessarily a bad thing. If you get cold, you shiver. And then once you've shivered for a little while, then you're warm, because the shivering is done in order to generate internal heat. So just because they come in shivering one day is not a reason to go throwing tons of blankets on them. But if they are shivering badly, or they shiver every time it rains a little bit, then those horses need to be blanketed during that type of weather. Things like snow rarely bother them. It's when they get sweaty and it gets their skin wet that they are going to get cold. So moisture coming from the outside, unless it's hard enough to get their skin wet, is not necessarily bad. And that's why snow rarely bothers them, because the snow comes down slowly enough that when it does finally melt, you can see icicles hanging off of the horses and they will be fine. Wind. Horses will naturally seek shelter from the wind, and if you watch, even in a small pasture, they will move to different places depending on where the wind is coming from. They do need some kind of shelter from the wind, and that can be a shed, it can be a patch of trees, but they shouldn't be just left to stand in the open with no shelter. This is another place, if you don't have the shelter, you can use a blanket and then they can stay outside. So if you look at this horse, you can see that there's sort of some icicles beginning to hang down off the edge of the coat. That's all on the outside. The horse is dry underneath all of this. Their skin is dry and they are warm. Horses live best when they're outside most of the time. They definitely are healthier. And they do best when they're outside for at least 8 to 12 hours a day. More time out is better if you can. And if you can't, that's okay too. They do adapt to cold better if they are out more. So if you just turn them out for an hour a day, it's kind of like yourself. If you work inside during the day, when you first come outside, it takes you an hour or so to adjust. So if they're only going to be out for a few hours, they really don't get adjusted. Is to clip or not to clip? I personally have been known to clip my horse just so I had an excuse to put a blanket on so that I didn't have to brush them so much. But in reality, I was riding the horse enough that he was sweating, and so I didn't. I needed to put a blanket on him, and I did need to clip him. So if you're going to clip and you're going to ride and they're going to get sweaty, clipping becomes really important. If you're going to just ride occasionally, it really might not be worth clipping, because you're going to then have to blanket them and change your blankets depending on the temperature. And sometimes it just isn't worth it to ride 2 or 3 times in the winter. But if you are going to ride hard, or you're getting fit, or you're going to be showing indoors on a regular basis, doing long trail rides during the cold weather, clipping is imperative, because it's the wetness against the skin that's going to make them cold. If you're just going to ride some, and your sport doesn't require a beautiful, fancy clipping job, you can literally just clip out the areas that sweat the most, usually on the base of their neck and their chest and around their flanks, which means that you don't have to blanket them nearly as much. That's totally personal preference. But even if you just clip a few holes in them on a windy night or a cold, wet night, you're going to still have to blanket them. As I said, the skin becomes wet from the inside out when they're sweating. If you want to dry your horse off, for them to be warm to go back outside, You can use hair dryers, and horses don't mind it once they've gotten used to it. If you have heat lamps, you can do that. You can use wool coolers, work great. The synthetic materials will also work. It does take some time to dry a horse out. Their fur is quite dense, and when you try to dry it out, you'll realize just how dense it really is. But it can be very worthwhile to get out a hairdryer and keep it at the barn and dry them off and avoid having to blanket them. With the individual horses, there are horses who hate blankets for a variety of reasons. Some of them, it's because they really are warm internally, and putting the blanket on makes them uncomfortably warm. You can put your hand inside the blanket. If they are moist inside the blanket or bordering on being moist, they are too warm inside, and they're probably becoming uncomfortable. Other horses hate blankets because they have had bad fitting blankets, and unfortunately they associate blankets with being very uncomfortable. Some horses hate blankets because their current blankets don't fit well, and I've got some pictures coming up to look at ways you can make blankets more comfortable. Some horses are cold-natured and they really need to have a blanket. And the old horses very often need to have a blanket. They may have been warm all their lives, but now that they're 25, 30, 35, they are not generating as much internal heat anymore. And so you have to add an external blanket in order to keep them warm. And if you put your hand underneath a blanket and you find that it feels cold under the blanket, and if your horse is behaving like they're a little bit cold, you may need to add more blankets. Cold behavior, if you observe the horse, when they're cold, they have a tendency to sort of huddle up. They can't quite curl up the way a dog does and tuck their tail in, but they sort of hunker down, maybe put their head and neck down. You'll see them standing in the sun all the time. You'll see them hiding away from the wind. And sometimes they're just telling you that they're cold. And some of them love to have their blankets on. So you really have to get to know the individual horse. And in a barn of 20 horses, you're going to have some cold and some warm. There is a blanket that I saw in England last year that they're putting, I think it's a Rambo, that they're putting a temperature gauge inside. And there can be some benefit to that. Sometimes it can help you to know what the actual temperatures are. But in reality, you can just put your hand inside and tell whether it is warm and cozy or damp and too warm, or whether it's actually cold. The other thing that happens is that when you put a blanket on, you do crush down some of the natural fluff in their fur. So if you're putting a really lightweight blanket on, say it's going to be 40 degrees and raining, you put a lightweight blanket on, that horse actually may be colder than if you had left the blanket off, because the lightweight blanket will compress the fur, but it doesn't add enough warmth to it to keep the horse warm. And that's when you'll put your hand underneath the blanket and it will feel cool. Blanket fitting is very important. Think about wearing a big, heavy winter coat all day and all night. And actually, those of you that wear coveralls, very often your shoulders are really tired by the end of the day. The heavy sort of Carhartt type coverall is a good similarity, a good comparison to a blanket. So your shoulders get tired from lifting it up all day. And these horses live in these things sometimes for months on end. So to decide whether your blanket is fitting or not, in the morning, when you go out check and see how tight the front buckles are. Check and see how much pressure is on the shoulder. It's much easier to check it after the horse has worn it all night, because that's what the horse is really feeling. When you first put it on, it may look great, but after it has settled into place and they've moved around, and you have to pull the buckles open in the morning really hard, that means that horse has been fighting against that pressure every step of the way all night long. We don't need the shoulders to have a lot of pressure on them, because those shoulders need to move forward and back. A lot of horses get stiff in the wintertime just because of blankets. So the most common issue with blankets is that they are too big around the neck opening. So when they get too big around the neck opening, they slide back. They may slide over the withers, and they slide down into the moving place of the shoulder. The part of the neck that doesn't move is actually on the neck and not on the shoulder. The amount of pressure that gets put on the withers or on the shoulder can be extreme depending on the situation. There is, however, one of the few things that's easy and cheap to fix in the horse world are blankets that are too big around the neck. All you have to do is find somebody with a big needle, or a person who does blanket repair is even better, or even leather repair. They'll have big enough needles, and then make a dart in the shoulder about halfway up, and that will pull the blanket forward into the part of the neck that does not move. You'll get it away from the moving part of the shoulder. Very simple thing to do. And then what happens, as you make that dart, you actually almost makes a pucker that frees up the whole shoulder area. So as you do this, you'll see that you pull the blanket forward and you get a nice hollow spot for the shoulder to move. You'll see a lot of blankets, and forget the names that are on these blankets. These are just blankets that I happened to see when I needed some pictures for this talk. What we want when we are looking at blankets, if we're going to put gussets in them, we want the gussets to be as high up on the shoulder as possible and away from the actual shoulder joint. So the purple blanket on the right has the gusset is almost at the level of the maximum amount of movement of the shoulder itself. And you can just about see the pressure lines going across, and the pressure is almost increased over the shoulder, the point of the shoulder here. And there's movement for the leg down here, but no movement area for the shoulder itself. The gusset on the left is placed a little bit higher on the shoulder, with the point of the shoulder being closer to the level of the buckles on this blanket. I would like to see, and I have seen a few blankets with the gussets placed even higher up to allow that shoulder to move more freely. But this one is going in the right direction. I've seen some blankets that have an adjustable neck area. So if the blanket's too loose, this is the same idea as sewing that little dart into it. When the blanket's too loose, then it sags back and you have a lot of tension over the shoulder itself. When you go ahead and tighten the elastic and pull the blanket forward on the shoulder, then your gusset starts to actually do more good. And you can see there's almost enough space here for the shoulder to move underneath it. couple of tips, things that I have seen quite a few of the sheets, the really lightweight blankets, or just a sheet, which is just a cover, but no insulation. I think when they make the sheets, they make it the same amount of material, but you don't have the insulation on the inside. So you measure a blanket and it's an 82. So you buy your sheet and it's an 82, but it really fits like it's an 84. And so it's too big and it slides back. So in this picture on top of here, we have a blanket that is, I would still say, a little bit too big around the neck. And underneath, you can see the sheet is poking through, and you can see the amount of pressure that's going across the horse's chest with these buckles, because the sheet has an even bigger hole for the neck. So the sheet itself is the problem. The blanket's not the problem. And lots of people want to put a sheet underneath the blanket. So make sure your sheet fits as well as your blanket does. One thing that happens sometimes when you make a big dart in the shoulder is you pull the blanket too far forward, and then you leave an area at the back that's exposed. And if it's a small area like this picture, it's really not too much of a problem. But if your blanket is suddenly 6 inches too short because you put a big dart in it, then your horse might be a little bit chilly in the rear end. A couple of tips which most of us should use with our common sense, but sometimes we forget. When we close our front buckles, we want to pull the blanket gently back into place, but not pull it back super tight. We don't need to tighten anything up across their shoulders unless that's what's happening to your blanket overnight. We really want to try and keep that blanket as loose as possible, so don't pull it really tight. The other tip that I see people do all the time, and I have been guilty of it on occasion myself, is taking the buckles off at the chest second. So undo your buckles underneath the horse's belly first and open your chest buckles last. I have certainly seen accidents happen where people undo the chest buckle because it's right there, it's convenient, and then something spooks the horse, but the belly buckles are still done up. And of course, the leg buckles have to be undone before you take off the chest buckles. So just try to avoid those simple little accidents. And when we have nice, quiet, easy horses, it's very easy to get complacent until a big piece of snow falls off your roof just as you're undoing your blanket and your horse takes off underneath you. So think about your blanketing. Blanket only if you really need to. In a perfect world, horses would prefer, for the most part, to not be blanketed. But ask yourself all these questions and adjust and adapt the blankets to the individual horse's needs, not yours. If you're a cold-natured person, you tend to put too many blankets on your horse. And if you're a hot-natured person, you may not think that your old horse is actually getting cold. So really think about it and pay attention to it and let the horses be horses. So that is all for tonight. If there's any questions, you can type them into the chat session or the Q&A place. And if there are no questions, then I would thank you all for attending. And we did get a question. Question is, how do you deal with static electricity when the blanket is removed? That can be a big problem, and some horses create more static electricity than others. Sometimes you have to look for different materials. You can use anti-static things that go in your dryer, but they're really full of chemicals, and I really don't like to use them. You can sometimes find a blanket liner. The more natural the material, like a wool under blanket, can be very useful, though they're much harder to find these days and can be quite expensive. Polar fleece and synthetic fleeces are the absolute worst if your horse gets static electricity, and wool is the best. Some of the materials, the really smooth materials that are on the inside of blankets, some brands of blankets, produce much less static electricity than others. So you have to look at that. And moisture can always help. So if you have a horse that's really sensitive, maybe you want to take a little spray bottle and just reach up underneath the blanket and add a little bit of moisture to it. Sometimes I have to actually wet my hands to work on some really sensitive horses in the wintertime. Any other questions? All right. Thank you all for coming. Have a great holiday season, and we'll see you in the new year. Oh, a whole bunch coming in. All right. Will wind chill affect blanketing choices? Yes, wind chill does affect blanketing choices to a certain extent. It depends on how much shelter the horse has in the pasture. So if you are in an open pasture without much shelter and fairly flat, then wind chill is going to be similar to what we experience. Not what we experience on our bear skin because we don't have any fur, but wind chill, a 30-mile-an-hour wind on a cold day without any shelter, those horses do need to have a blanket. And they may not, the temperature could be, say, 30 degrees with a 30-mile-an-hour wind. Technically, super heavy blanket, but as soon as you put a lightweight blanket on, you're compressing the fur, so you actually would end up needing probably a medium weight blanket so that you actually have some insulation value along with the wind chill. Are there good ways to ensure that blankets stay waterproof? Well, the companies will provide some sort of re-waterproofing. There are various different compounds that you can get that will waterproof blankets. There are companies that make one. I think there's a company that makes a kind of a waterproofing material for outdoor furniture, Formula 303 or something like that. I'm not sure how well that does on the blanketing material, but it's usually a pretty safe formula. But the different companies will have re-waterproofing compounds. Other than that, the horses like to roll in the mud, and mud is very abrasive. It's going to wear off some of the waterproofing. Do you have recommendations for Cushing's horses? The same thing applies, really, that we talked about. Some of the Cushing's horses are actually running too hot inside, and some of those guys I will feed some cooling herbs to. You'll see horses, some of those guys don't have a good temperature regulating mechanism, and they will be sweating when the other horses are not sweating. Those guys don't need extra blankets. Others of the Cushing's horses will actually be a little bit too cold. And so no matter what their age, you're still asking yourself, is this horse cold-natured or warm-natured? and blanket appropriately for that temperature. Any other questions? Okay. That might have really finished off our questions. So thank you all for coming, and we will talk to you in the new year. Have a great holidays. The link will be, the link will be posted like all of ours up onto the YouTube channel. And we will be sending you a link just as we've done in the past. Okay, take care.